This, folks, of course, would be the first version of the game of the year in the Big Ten. So this is one of three. And sorry, Western Division fans, we are going to ignore you for at least today and throughout the rest of this week. But we will see if things change come Indianapolis first week of December. Welcome into Buckeyes Live Special Edition. We got Pat Murphy here from Bucknuts 247 Sports. Get on over there to 247 bucknuts.com. This is the way to prep for the big game, be an expert, understand all the angles and the storylines going into the game. Penn State, Ohio State kickoff at noon Eastern time. Pat, how you doing?
I am good. Looking forward to it. This has been a busy but good week, as you would expect. And then we got some bonus stuff to talk about when that Michigan news came out yesterday. So
yes,
crazy busy week.
When something like that happens, I don't know whether you're a go-to guy or not, because I figure, man, he's just busy doing everything he has to do covering Ohio State, or it is Michigan. So
yeah,
we had fans care.
I had a guy on our show, Bill Bender of the Sporting News yesterday, and he said he was out doing yard work and got a notification about it and was just like, oh God, I have to go take care of this. And he messaged me and was like, I'm still able to come on. Don't worry. I was like, okay, good.
Yeah, it kind of, there are certain stories that break that kind of stop everything if you're in a certain line of work, as sure. I've chosen to be. So here we go. Yeah, I did the same thing. Let's go live. Let's talk about it. Let's see what this could be all about. So we may get to that at some point this next hour or so. We got Pat here. Leave those comments and questions there in the chat. You guys ultimately produce the show. Pat, I'm going to think, besides, the breaking news from yesterday, but focused on Ohio State, that you've spoken a little bit and written something about the offensive line. I got to think that's been there somewhere where you've been had to address that, because that seems to be at the forefront of people's concerns.
Absolutely. You look at what Penn State brings at defensive end, and it's got to be a concern if you're Ohio State. Now, look, Ohio State's pass blocking has been pretty good with this offensive line. It's been the run defense, or the run blocking, that has been the major issue. But the Buckeyes haven't faced a defensive line like the one that Penn State has with Adisa Isaac and Chalk Robinson and that group that they rotate through. It's a really talented front. So these tackles of Josh Simmons, Josh Fryer, are going to be tested at a level that they have not yet. I have some faith that they can hold up, and I think the Buckeyes can do some things, using tight ends to help block, things like that to help give Kyle McCord time. There's also obviously some quick game stuff that they can do, getting the ball out of Kyle McCord's hands quickly. But we saw last week a couple times against Purdue, when he was under pressure, put the ball on the ground. Once was a fumble. The other one was eventually ruled intentional grounding, which actually decreased the loss of yardage for the Buckeyes, which was interesting that the penalty was actually benefit for Ohio State. But Kyle McCord has to be smarter on those. The line has to hold up for sure. And it's going to be a key matchup in this game is first of all, how really good are these Penn State defensive ends? And I think they're very good. And then what can the Ohio State tackles and frankly, the offensive coaching staff come up with to limit their effectiveness when pass rushing Kyle McCord?
Pat, in your conversations with the coaching staff, with the news conference, both after last week's game and then this week, combined with just your knowledge of personnel and options that could be available, do you think that there are possible changes, not necessarily that could be forthcoming in the starting lineup, but some whether they be different players that could factor into the rotation or different position assignments that could be the next step?
You talking on the offensive line?
Along the offensive line, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a ton behind this starting group, and it's interesting because in the preseason, the coaching staff. Now, preseason talk is very different than once you get in the regular season, right? Everybody's positive in the preseason. Things are going well. Everybody's doing good things in practice. And so we heard about that the depth was starting to form on the offensive line. And then a couple weeks ago, Ryan Day was asked about it. Justin Fry was asked about it, if they would think of making changes. This was coming off that Maryland game where they only rushed for 62 yards. And both Ryan Day, came out and said that the backups really hadn't pushed, and he felt that the starters had started to separate even more, but the backups hadn't pushed to get closer to starting, or I think he put it basically that hadn't earned more than the 20 or 30 reps that they've gotten so far. Justin Fry was a little bit more careful with his words, just saying he thought that the starting group had pulled ahead further than they were at the start of the season. But you can tell that there's not just like this abundance of confidence in the depth. I do think Luke Montgomery, the true freshman from Ohio, is a guy to keep an eye on. If things go wrong Saturday, if this offensive line just can't protect and the tackles are an issue, maybe down the road you start to play Luke Montgomery more. They do like him a lot. He has played the most snaps of any offensive lineman that isn't one of the starting five, coming in as kind of like a sixth offensive lineman. I think technically he's a tight end when he comes in the game, but in their bigger packages, wears number 98 when he comes into the game. So he's a guy who I think they're probably highest on if they had to move on to a different tackle. I'm not sure that he is completely ready for that, and it would be, it would be a lot. But if you lose to Penn State and the tackles are a reason why, then maybe you start to think, okay, well, the season may not go the way we want anyway. Why don't we start to look ahead? Now, I say that, but Josh Fryer and Josh Simmons both have eligibility left after this season. So unless they really amp it up here over the final 6 games and whatever postseason Ohio State has, I imagine both guys plan on coming back next year. And so then you kind of have a situation on your hand. In terms of the interior of the offensive line, I actually think it's been pretty good. The center, Carson Hinsman, for a first-time starter, has been solid, I'll say, has snapped the ball well, which is priority number one. Still needs to work on his blocking, but he's literally doing this all for the first time. He didn't play a snap last year. So I think he's been, as good as to be expected. They do have Victor Cutler, who transferred in the offseason, played at a lower level last year. He was in the mix early on, hasn't played a ton, so I don't see much of a change coming there. I think they're willing to have some growing pains with him. And then Donovan Jackson and Matthew Jones have played pretty well. I think Matthew Jones maybe has been the most consistent offensive lineman at right guard. Donovan Jackson was a guy who's projected as maybe an All-American and one of the first guards taken in the NFL draft. I don't know if he's played up to that level, but he's still been better than anyone else they have behind them. I think, frankly, what this all boils down to is Ohio State hasn't recruited well on the offensive line. Under Greg Studrawa, it was kind of a mess. Greg Studrawa had some health issues that may have impacted that and things like that. And then the guys that they have brought in, the development hasn't been at the level that you would expect at Ohio State. And Justin Fry is working on that. They're working to recruit higher level players and develop the guys that they do have. But when the reserves aren't full, then you don't have a lot of options, and you're seeing a little bit of that there. The transfer portal should have been a way for Ohio State to address this offseason. They did bring in, as I mentioned, Victor Cutler, Josh Simmons, who's playing left tackle. Neither of those guys were guys that I think Buckeye fans were overly excited about, given they came from, as I mentioned, lower level schools. Now, not to say that guys can't step up. We've seen it happen before, but Ohio State didn't go out and land one of the top tackles. I think there's a number of reasons you could point to that, NIL being one of them. And I think the Buckeyes are probably better positioned going forward in the transfer portal and in recruiting to land those players. But it didn't happen this offseason, and you're kind of living with the results right now.
And you said something there about NIL that would raise some eyebrows in regards to, okay, was that just in that particular situation, or should this be a concern going forward that Ohio State will not be competitive in those type of recruiting of sorts, not of the high school ranks, but in the transfer portal of players?
Yeah, I think they've figured things out better. I really think it kind of started to get going last spring-ish. Ohio State was pretty reticent to kind of dive into the full NIL game. They still are. They are not just going to make sure that these guys get paid absorbent amounts of money before they do anything. And, they've started to establish these collectives that now have specific kind of roles under the umbrella. And I think it's just better positioned now. And I think you've seen it. I think even if you just look at recruiting, there have definitely been some guys that you probably don't get unless you are willing to work the NIL game. And I do think that will impact in the transfer portal. I just think there were some schools that were on top of this and kind of ready to go. And Ohio State was more waiting for rules and things to come out about the NIL situation. And that hasn't happened, as everyone knows. They just had a legislation meeting, whatever. I'm not in that field, but there was conversation about it this past week. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So I think Ohio State realized, okay, we've got to play this game or we're going to get left behind. And they've gotten kind of their act together in that sphere. And I do think it will help them going forward. I just think that, you may pay the price a little bit this year. Now, I say that when we're talking about the offensive line, I do think there's an issue, but they did land a guy in Davison Igbinosun from Ole Miss, who is a starting cornerback for this team and has played pretty well so far this season. Now everybody's different, right? Not every player is looking for big NIL checks to come to a certain program. I don't know the situation with any of these guys, frankly. I do think had the NIL situation been different, say last January, you're probably bringing in a tackle at a higher level that you were putting in the starting lineup right away. But I do think that, like I said, I think they'll be better positioned going forward. You just kind of have to deal with what you've got right now.
We have seen certain sites and certain listings that seem to have some idea of what the NIL collectives are gathering and distributing to players, but then I hear from other sources that those are extremely speculative and projections and all sorts of things in regards to NIL, both collection by the program and the individual distribution per player.
Yeah, I mean, the whole situation is still a bit of a mess, right? It's not, I think, what was intended, which was, look, you are, if you are a student athlete and you can market yourself on social media, or you have a YouTube channel, or whatever the case may be, you should be able to make money off of that, just like any college student can. Now it's become almost paying players like they're professionals. And look, you have to adapt to what the situation is. And that is the situation that they live in. It's the same with the transfer portal. You look at a school like Clemson that won't use the transfer portal and the results that you've gotten. Ohio State was a little slow to get in on the transfer portal. This past year was the most players they've landed out of the transfer portal. And you're starting to see some results there. So you have to adjust with what's going on, whether you like it or not. And maybe at some point, NIL gets some guidelines, some guardrails, as people say, and it looks more like what everyone hoped or what the rule was intended to be. But, you've kind of already let the genie out of the bottle, right? Guys are making a lot of money. I know that there are sites that keep track of, how much guys are worth and whatnot. And I don't know how you then go back on that and just say, oh, well, make money off of your Twitter account or your Instagram account, and that's it. So this may be the world that we live in college sports going forward.
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any reason or any logic, common sense that's directed toward these situations. We went from one extreme in which college athletes weren't treated like the rest of society. We're in a free society in which people can go out at whatever level. A 13-year-old can go make money on TikTok.
Right.
So we go from that extreme where they're the one category in society that can go out there and make a dime to, inducements and basically paying them directly, where to me, it should be, number one category would be you're simply an American citizen and able to earn money just like anybody else out on social media or Instagram, but that we also have organized collectives that can help you. But that is not going to be an inducement to come to this university. Basically, we lay out a situation where these are the collectives that we've established. You can go talk to any player. You're free to talk to anyone concerning what they were able to do if they're going to give you that information. But your recruitment is still out of high school based on uh, all the things that those choices have been made in the past, but with the knowledge that these collectives are in play, and we will help you once you are signed and enrolled, and you're a player, and you're going to class, and then we deal with that. But hopefully, we can get to that point at some point. But like you say, we probably now swung completely to the opposite end of the spectrum. We got Pat Murphy here from Bucknuts 247 Sports. Please join Pat on a regular basis. Of course, this is an enormous week. I'm sure traffic is up at Bucknuts. Get on over there, check out Pat's work, as Penn State is only a day away. And actually, we're just about 24 hours away from kickoff here. So, staying with the offensive line, by extension, of course, the running game. So, what impressed me about the Purdue game, not trying to sell Purdue as some great football team, because they're not. Although, if you really look at Purdue, they've played one of the more legitimate schedules in the country. They haven't played any FCS or low group of five teams. Like every week, they've played somebody decent. So their metrics are probably as credible as anybody in the country. That Ohio State, number one, just looked better blocking just up front, opening lanes and so forth. But they also got creative in the running game. And that was without Emeka Ibuka being there, who is the go-to guy as a wide receiver, getting some involvement in the running game. Of course, Xavier Johnson comes into the game, and Dallin Hayden's there. And I know some of that was forced by injury, of course. Chip Tranum, hopefully he's okay, just took an enormous hit off a pass reception in the flat. But it looked like they've come to a realization we may not be able to be a dominant running game in a traditional sense. So we're going to have to figure out creative ways to create rushing yardage.
Yeah, and you didn't even mention Devin Brown coming in as that dual threat quarterback, which we could touch on. But I mean, I think, yes, they got creative, and they've done some of that throughout the year. They did more of it, I think, and the injuries probably played a part. They knew Xavier Johnson was going to be more involved because he's played running back before, and now he's at wide receiver, so he can line up at various places. But they also, and maybe this was just the fact that Dallin Hayden came into the game and he's still a younger player and whatnot and hasn't played a ton of football. They simplified things and they went with what worked. And I think sometimes, they want to play these outside zone schemes and things like that instead of just gap runs. That seems to work for a lot of these running backs. And Dallin Hayden obviously hit on a handful of those in that game, looked good. And I know there's a lot of debate. I've seen it this week about Dallin Hayden and whether he should play more because he seems to be the most effective runner at just sort of hitting the hole and going, as opposed to his pass blocking, which is not nearly as good. And I think there's certainly some conversation there, and that's definitely held him back. But just schematically, I think that is kind of the blueprint that Ohio State should take going forward. I know they want to do, a handful of things, but if it's not working, if the offensive line, I think if you go back to the Maryland game, Joel Klatt highlighted it really well about offensive linemen blocking the same guy and leaving a linebacker to come through, not getting to the second level. If you keep it simple and just run what these guys are good at instead of maybe forcing some things on them, asking them to be more athletic and get out and pull block and stuff. There are ways that teams can run the ball without having the talent that Ohio State frankly does have. Use the things that work best. This will not relate entirely, but I am a Los Angeles Rams fan, and they have two running backs who are in Kyron Williams and Ronnie Rivers, both hurt, unfortunately. But both guys see the hole, hit the hole. That's what they are. And that's how they've designed the running game this year for them. And it's been very effective. And I think Ohio State could do something similar. And I bring that up because I know, in talking to Tony Alford, the running backs coach previously, they used to watch a lot of Rams stuff because of their outside zone stuff they used to do. So I think you can use some of that same stuff. And there's plenty of examples, not just in the NFL, of teams that have success with, maybe it's not the best offensive line, or maybe it's not even the most talented running back, but you can find ways to be productive. Now, short yardage situations, things become more difficult. I think that's why they've gone to some of the more creative things down there with Devin Brown, and we'll see how much that continues. But I do think the Purdue game gave you at least a blueprint of, okay, these things worked. Will they work against a Penn State defensive line, Penn State linebackers? Maybe not as well, but I still think they'll be more effective. Additionally, just having Travion Henderson, who I do think will play in this game, he's warmed up before the last 2 games. I think having him back helps quite a bit. And it's kind of stating the obvious there if you look at the numbers, but his big playability kind of bandages over the lack of a running game elsewhere. Now, you still want to be able to turn what has been 1 and 2 yard runs into 3 and 4 yard runs to stay on schedule. But at least with Travion Henderson being able to break some runs, you're able to, get the numbers at the end of the game that you want. And he's, obviously against Notre Dame, that 61, I think it was, yard touchdown was something that turned that game right after halftime. Plays like that you don't get from the other guys. And I think him being back will certainly help. But you do need to still be able to get some of those other runs. And I think some of the scheme stuff they did last week is maybe a look into the future of how they can be more effective.
So I'm not a scout. I'm not a coach. Well, first of all, I'm curious. Should I take a guess as to how you became a Rams fan?
I am from St. Louis originally. I moved to Columbus when I was about 10 years old. And that was roughly, right around the time I left St. Louis was when they were really good with Kurt Warner and Marshall Faulk and those guys.
Yeah.
So I stayed a Rams fan. And then when they moved to LA, it didn't really affect. Actually, it was better because they were on TV more before the YouTube packages and stuff like that. So that's why, and I've stuck with that. My girlfriend's a big Cleveland Browns fan, so we also support them. And then my neighbor, who's my friend since I was in elementary school, once I moved to Columbus, is a big Bengals fan. So we've got a lot going on in this little area here.
Yeah, that was going to be my guess, that it was related to the greatest show on turf in that era. Very nice. But you were from St. Louis.
Yeah.
Okay. Felipe, appreciate you checking in. Threw on his YouTube TV, saw us live. Thanks, Felipe. All right. Appreciate Pat being here. You can catch Pat's work at bucknuts.com. We also have an Ohio State show that we do every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. So lock in on that every Wednesday, 11 a.m. Eastern time. All right. I'm not a coach. I'm not a scout. I'm just a guy that watches a ton of football, that's been doing this for a long time. And I try to stay in my lane in regards to, this is what I know. This is what I understand. And I'm not the guy that's second guessing every play call and those sorts of things. Not that I haven't at times. So when it comes to Dallin Hayden, though, ever since that Maryland game, I was like, and I was thinking the same thing watching him run against Purdue. Okay, you can't account for speed, explosiveness, strength, those sorts of things that can be measured. Then there's just this aspect of vision, instinct, natural ability that's not necessarily measured in any specific way, that he just seems to have. To me, looks like the best running back on the team. And I know Travion Henderson, I kind of go back and forth in regards to his impact against a Penn State defense, because he's the guy that may get thrown for a 2-yard loss, gain 2, your 10 carries into the game, and then all of a sudden, boom, 60. And that's a play that you can't even measure in a sense. It's almost worth more because he can put points on the board like that, like he did against Notre Dame. We'll never know what would have happened if somebody else would have been handed the football in the same exact blocking scheme and execution, but he's obviously a home run hitter, and maybe Dallin Hayden is not in that class in that way. But I don't know if that's negated by a fast, explosive, NFL-ready Penn State defense, or if that actually becomes a better commodity to have a guy that, even if the running game's not consistent, can hit 1 or 2 that make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd like to have a balance, right? You'd like to have, and I think that's what they hope to have with last year, TreVeyon Henderson and Mayan Williams, injuries affected that. This year with TreVeyon Henderson and Chip Tranum, injuries have now affected that too. I think the Mayan conversation is very interesting because last year it sounded like ball security may have been an issue, and he was a true freshman playing football. Whether he was fumbling in practice or not, Ryan Day brought it up quite a bit. This year, he was asked directly this week about ball security. He said, no, you can check that box. Dallin takes care of the ball. But he kept referring to when he's really good with the ball in his hands, which means something when he doesn't have the ball in his hands. And I alluded to it earlier, the pass protection stuff. Now, I do think that there are ways that you can handle that. And you can look across the field on Saturday at Penn State, a team that plays both their running backs in the backfield at the same time. Sometimes they put a tight end in the backfield at times. There are ways I think you could, if you need Dallin Hayden to run the ball, can scheme to still be able to pass block with him in there. And they obviously did that some against Purdue. They did it last year against Maryland. Even in the Georgia game, he was in there quite a bit, even though his numbers weren't great. So I think there are ways around that. If the full complement of running backs are healthy, I still think they will be more hesitant to use Dallin Hayden just because of that, because they can run more of their offense with the other guys. But I agree with you. The way he runs, and he has been effective doing it, is as good as Ohio State's had on a consistent basis with this current kind of crop of running backs. I also kind of wonder what's going on with Mayan Williams. We heard before I think it was the Maryland game, he'd had a really good week of practice. Then TreVeyon Henderson doesn't play. Mayan Williams ends up with just 6 carries from that game. I don't, he was an effective runner for them last year and just kind of has fallen behind Chip Tranum, which is fine. But when you're down one running back, you would assume he would get more of the workload. And it's not like Chip was entirely effective against Maryland. Again, the Buckeyes rushed for 62 yards. I think the running backs accounted for like 81, but then there were sacks and whatnot. So it's been an interesting kind of situation with Ohio State. I think in an ideal world, TreVeyon Henderson would have been the bell cow back that an Ezekiel Elliott or a J.K. Dobbins was. He was the top-ranked back in the country when they recruited him, and then the other guys could have just been compliments. It hasn't worked out that way for them, and so they've had to kind of piecemeal it together. And I don't think it's been as effective as when they've been able to put one guy out there for most of the snaps and let him do the work. That comes down to recruiting. And look, they've been fine in recruiting running backs. Could they be better? Yes. There are some guys, some big name guys that they're currently in the mix with in the future. But right now you've got a stable of backs. I think finding the best way to use them when all healthy, which has been the issue, is going to be what you need to do. And it would not surprise me if they're back to closer to full health on Saturday against Penn State. When we saw the guys walking off the practice field on Wednesday night before interviews, it looked like all 4 of the top backs had practiced and looked ready to go. So based on that, it wouldn't surprise me if they have close to a full group on Saturday.
Of course, we'd have to go back to the Georgia game, but I just looked up the stats here. Dallin Hayden went for 9 carries for 43 yards. He had a 17-yarder against Georgia, so he was fairly effective in that game. But we would have to go back and analyze the pass pro aspect of it, of course, because that's huge. Yeah, Mayan Williams against Maryland, if I recall, it seemed as though he was kind of the guy that salted away the game the last couple drives. Yeah. That's when they got some push and he was able to rip off some decent runs, and I was a bit encouraged by that. And then he was non-existent against Purdue. So I don't know what sometimes happens to these guys the last play of one game when they're able to play, and then the next week they disappear. So
yeah, I mean, look, football is a violent game, right? And these guys practice and hit, and there are also people that it's the time of year where people get sick, and I mean, we could speculate because Ohio State doesn't like to give updates on what was wrong. It does seem to hit the running back room the hardest, though, these last 2 seasons. There's just been a lot of unavailables from that position group, unfortunately, for Ohio State, which is strange. But, I made a comment on our message board recently because people were complaining about why Ohio State is the most banged up team in the country. And I think if you go to any message board, you will find fans complaining about injuries. I mean, look at Georgia, obviously just lost maybe the best player on their team, maybe for the season. And, Ohio State hasn't had to deal with that, fortunately. People get hurt. It happens in football, happens in all sports. And, I think this is very unfortunate timing for Ohio State because of Penn State coming in. If this happened, in a week or so, or it happened earlier in the season, they've been able to get through it. It'd be different, but you can't control when injuries or other things happen.
Got to appreciate and chuckle at Darren Talks Ball here. Don't mind me. I'm just in here to gather info on Michigan's future opponents. There we go.
Well played.
All right, we'll finally get to Kyle McCord. Can't believe we've talked this much Buckeye football without getting to the guy that is, of course, key in all this as well. When you get to these kind of games, it's like, what's the key? Well, everybody needs to play well.
Yeah.
You look at every unit and you're like, well, they're a key, they're a key, they're a key. Okay, Kyle McCord is obviously one of the linchpins in all this. So his situation in regards to at least my evaluation is he seems to be progressing well. He seems to address and limit some issues that are there. Early in the season, it was him just not seeing certain things. And then there was pocket awareness that I think he still is developing, of course, as a young quarterback. He's only played 6 games in regards to hearing footsteps or all the things that are required in navigating the pocket there and looking downfield. And I think he's just getting better and better with all of those things. I saw him make some throws against Purdue that I don't necessarily know that he was making a few weeks earlier, trusting the receivers, throwing the ball just by guys' helmets in regards to defensive backs and just over their shoulders and showing that kind of arm talent. And so where do you stand on Kyle McCord's progress?
Yeah, progress is the word I would use. He certainly made that. There are steps in the right direction. Is he the finished product yet? No. Is he CJ Stroud or Justin Fields right now? No. I was writing something yesterday and came across this. He leads the Big Ten in passing yards per game. He's second in QB rating and fourth in touchdown passes. And I realized that the Big Ten doesn't have the world's greatest quarterbacks, but he's top 20 in 2 of those 3 stats in the country. So look, is he what Ohio State fans have grown to expect from quarterbacks under Ryan Day? Not yet. Will he get there? I think there's that potential. You mentioned, some throws last week. The touchdown pass to Cade Stover, the first one, where they just had a touchdown called back and he just rifles it in. Cade catches it out here. That's one where he has to fit it into a fairly tight window in tight space down in the red zone. Delivered on that. He's had some very nice throws to Marvin Harrison Jr. There was the one on the sideline a couple weeks ago, I believe, that got them a first down on 3rd and 22 or something like that. Literally, Marvin Harrison was the only guy they were going to go to there. Purdue or whoever the opponent was knew it, covered him, and he still fitted in to Marv. So throws like that are where you see the progress coming. It's just about consistency, I think, ultimately with Kyle. And that comes as you play more, obviously. I think Buckeye fans would like to see it speed up a little bit. Certainly, you're going to need it in this game. I saw some people in the comments talking about Drew Aller versus Kyle McCord in terms of throwing interceptions. Between them, they've thrown 1 interception this season. Yeah, I think it could come down to something as simple as like who doesn't make the big mistake in this game on Saturday between the 2 quarterbacks. They've both been very efficient. Kyle, I think is lucky to probably not have a couple. There was one against Notre Dame that probably should have been picked off, and one other that comes to mind. But that happens to every quarterback, right? Sometimes they pick you off, sometimes they don't. So yeah, I like the progress of McCord. I think, especially playing behind an offensive line that we talked about earlier that isn't as dominant as some of the ones that CJ Stroud and Justin Fields had. He's been very good. I think his movement in the pocket is really solid. He's shown the willingness to run. I liked the fact He had that 9-yard where he kept the ball against Purdue. I do wonder if maybe they use him in some similar situations as they did Devin Brown last week, so you don't have to substitute quarterbacks out, because I think he can be an effective runner over short distances. He's not going to beat anybody like a Braxton Miller or even a JT Barrett, but he can do it a little bit. So you're just seeing more and more each week get put on his plate, and I think he's responding pretty well to it.
Pat Murphy's here talking Buckeyes with us. Join Pat right there at bucknuts.com. Get set for the Penn State game. We're only 12 or 24 hours away. If you want to go to the game, we've got a way for you to do that. In a sense, at least we can send you to the right place there. Ticketsmarter.com or the TicketSmarter app. Just download that. It's the best secondary site on the market, safe and secure. You get the promo code BIG or BIG20. Use the BIG20 for purchases over $300. The get-in price right now, Pat, we understand Ohio State, Penn State's $170. Gets you in the stadium somewhere, probably up near the rafters, but $600 lower bowl is what we're looking at right now. So, folks, Ticket Smarter if you want to get to that Ohio State, Penn State game or any game in college football, and you can use it over and over and over. That promo code does not run out. Well, we'll talk about the defense here. And that Purdue game, when I mention it being impressive to me, top to bottom, and in terms of its complete look, that includes, of course, the defense, which I don't know that you can be too critical about thus far. Of course, we're waiting for the heavy hitters on the schedule, but the defense has been close to rock solid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can look at what they've done in a couple different games to kind of get a sense of how they're going to play against Penn State. I think you see how they handled a talented quarterback in Taulia Tagovailoa against Maryland, but then also what they did in a big game situation against Notre Dame. I've said this a bunch. I even asked Jim Knowles about this because after the Notre Dame game, he was asked about being more of a bend but don't break defense instead of being that aggressive defense we saw last year when the Buckeyes got burned a few times in bad situations. And he didn't like the term bend don't break. I asked him this week, why not? Because that's more or less what Ohio State has been this year. And he said, I don't know, I just don't like it. And I asked, how would you define this defense? And he said, one that doesn't give up a bunch of points and big plays, which is exactly what they've been. And it's because they're kind of putting a cap on the back end of the defense. The longest play they've allowed this season is 38 yards. I think they've also allowed 2 more plays maybe of 30 or more yards, which given kind of how last season ended is pretty good. I think last year they were allowing 4 or 5 big plays a game. So steps in the right direction for sure. I think if you want to be critical of this defense, have the linebackers played as well as last year? No, they're being asked to do different things, which maybe don't completely fit their skill set. I think it's why you're seeing a little bit more Cody Simon, and Steele Chambers has not played as much as he did a year ago. And then the defensive line and the pass rush. Look, I think their pass rush has come more from the interior with Michael Hall and Tyleik Williams than it has on the edge because JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer just aren't natural pass rushers, despite playing defensive ends. JT Tuimoloau can do a lot of different things, and he can get after the passer. Jack Sawyer can too. You saw it last week, but they're not just like natural, we're going to rush the quarterback over and over again. They're both really good in the run game. JT Tuimoloau obviously can use his athleticism in ways that most defensive ends can only dream of. You saw that against Penn State a year ago. But all in all, I think the goal of this defense has been not to give up big plays and not to allow points, and they've done a really good job of that. Now, Penn State's offense, I don't know if it's the best offense they've faced. You look at the statistics; they're in a similar spot as like a Notre Dame and whatnot. But it will certainly be a challenge because you are playing legitimate Big Ten, opponents on the offensive side of the ball there. So I think both teams, the defense, will know a little bit more about them coming out of this game on Saturday.
You mentioned when we talked about the transfer portal, Davison Igbinosun before. I haven't seen too many defensive backs, cornerbacks that play as aggressively as he does down the field. Now, depending on the officiating crew and how they see that, I guess is going to depend on how many times he gets flagged, because he does like to size up the receiver downfield.
Yeah, and the way they've played him is more off coverage this year. I think because of that aggressive approach, that allows him, if his man does catch the ball, to come up and make the tackle, as opposed to being in tight coverage and handsy and getting a flag. What will be interesting is if Denzel Burke does not play, and he left the Purdue game early last week with what I think's a lower leg injury. It was hard to tell because they put the medical tent up right before the staff was looking at him. But if he doesn't play, then I imagine you see Davison Igbinosun playing in Burke's spot, which is the boundary side more often than not. And that's a bit more, that press man coverage. Not all the time. It's not like Ohio State when they had Denzel Ward and Marshawn Lattimore, where they were playing almost exclusively press man, but it requires more of that. And so how does that work? There's also the possibility that you could play freshman Jermaine Matthews, who came in for Denzel Burke last week for a little bit. He could play there. Jordan Hancock could move from the nickel spot to the outside as well, and you could use more Sonny Styles against Penn State. But yeah, I mean, look, I think Davison Igbinosun is capable of playing wherever they ask him to do that. He said as much this week when we spoke with him. He just has to be careful about kind of that physicality, which is part of his game and what makes him a really good cornerback. You just can't get caught with, for lack of a better term, your hand in the cookie jar at the wrong time and, give up penalties that end up hurting the team.
Yeah, I'm sure the coaches have worked with him, because you take that aggressiveness and then you work on the technique to make it more user friendly in terms of what you show to the officials. We appreciate the super chats coming in. Do want to hit on this Sue question first, and this is regarding maybe a topic we'll get to. We could take off on it right now. Do you think that the info regarding Michigan possibly cheating to help beat us in 2021 and 22 lights some special fire in Ryan Day? I'd bet he's pissed off to hear this.
Well, from what I understand of this situation, it sounds like most of the Big Ten coaches were kind of aware of this situation. So I don't know. I mean, this is just speculation on my part, but I don't know if this is news to Ryan Day. They may have been aware of this within the Woody Hayes Athletic Center. But I don't know if you need much more fire under Ryan Day this year. He's been about as animated. I know that the Peacock broadcast caught him, chewing out guys and stuff last week. Obviously, the post-game comments after the Notre Dame game, he was asked about this kind of fiery persona he's taken on this year. And he said, it's kind of depends on the team that you have. And he said, this team likes to be coached hard. And so it's obviously working for them. I don't know if that means previous teams, he wouldn't have gotten on guys as they come off. I think, he definitely has done that in the past. It's not like this is a completely new thing, but look, to be completely honest, there is a lot of pressure on Ryan Day, more pressure than there has been previously, because he's lost 2 games in a row to Michigan. And even though the Georgia game was this close game and Ohio State looked like they went toe to toe with the national champions, they didn't win. And, the standard at Ohio State, and Ryan Day knows it. He said it. You win all your games, you beat Michigan, you win the Big Ten, you contend for national titles. And they were doing that under him for the first few years. And then obviously the last 2 seasons with the losses to Michigan have meant no Big Ten championship games and only 1 of 2 college football playoff appearances. So I don't think Ryan Day is on any sort of hot seat at this point, but there's just a lot of pressure of being the Ohio State head coach, especially when you have now lost to Michigan in back-to-back years. And I think you're seeing that reflected. And I think he's channeled it in a positive way to just kind of push this team that he thinks really responds well to that.
Yeah, and on the surface, it doesn't appear to be a good setup for the Michigan game going into the season. Michigan's loaded. Their returning production is through the roof. they'll be at home for the game, all those things. And then Ohio State breaking in a new quarterback. Although, the returning production for Ohio State, we're going to see this in the NFL draft, is, wow, the talent is just through the roof for them. So it just, Michigan has raised its game one way or the other. I made the comment, and there are all sorts of ways to improve a football program. It just can't necessarily come through recruiting that, bam, if you are typically 10 to 15 in recruiting and you raise that a notch and then you're more in the top 3 to 5, that you're automatically going to be better, and that's the only way you can do it. But when we look at Michigan's acquisition of talent, certainly they've done well in the transfer portal. They've made key additions in the transfer portal, especially along the offensive line, defensive pass rushers, the last couple of seasons. So more impact from Michigan in the transfer portal than Ohio State. Now, if you look at recruiting rankings, the same rated classes that produced teams that generally were in that 9-3 range, not beating Ohio State for the first 6-7 years of Jim Harbaugh's tenure, now are winning Big Ten championships and getting past Ohio State. So we'll see what comes of this this whole investigation.
Yeah, I think. Look, the Michigan team the last 2 years has been really talented, right? And I think they deserve what they've gotten on the field. It will be interesting, as you just said, to see kind of what does come out of this, because those are obviously the 2 years that they beat Ohio State. They play in the Big Ten championship game, and they go to the college football playoff. And then the college football playoff, they don't have nearly the same success. I think you've got to kind of wait and see here. I don't want to make sweeping generalizations that scouting opponents potentially illegally and things were the only reason that Michigan had success these 2 years. I think you can see the talent on the field. But yeah, again, it will be interesting to see what comes of all this, because it does coincide with kind of this reemergence of the Wolverines. Now, I say that, and there were certainly other years that Jim Harbaugh could have won those games. I mean, you think back to the game in Columbus with Curtis Samuel scoring the late touchdown. Like, that obviously could have gone the other way, and that changes things, right? So certainly some other reasons behind it, but this is definitely interesting.
And to me, once the investigation's complete and the truth is hopefully discovered, it's a pretty open and shut case to me that if they didn't cheat, and then there are different interpretations by fans in terms of how severe is the cheating? Does the cheating really matter? Well, to me, maybe my thinking's flawed, but there's only one reason you cheat. That's to gain an advantage that's going to change the result. Otherwise, you wouldn't cheat. If I know that I'm going to win the game anyway, then why would I cheat? Right. Even if it's that much, I have decided that the risk is worth cheating to change the intended result, and that's winning and winning championships. So if they cheated in any way, regardless of whether you think it should be a rule, the rule is there for everyone. And it's been in place since 1994 that you cannot advance scout teams in person on campus. So that's all there is to it. And then if in fact they did that, I don't have an issue with all sorts of penalties coming their way. I just think that if you've done something to gain an advantage, then regardless of, we can debate all day how much of an advantage you gain, just the act of cheating, I think you take wins away.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like, this keeps getting compared to the Spygate situation in the NFL with New England Patriots. And that was, I think the punishment was a draft pick, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So like, you don't have draft picks in college football. So what do you take these wins away from those 2 years? That, what is that real though? I mean, look, Ohio State lost the wins for a season in the Tattoo Gate stuff, but Buckeye fans still remember that those games happened. Like, is that a real punishment? Yeah. I'm never a big fan of punishing teams that weren't involved, players that weren't involved in this situation. Can you do you punish Jim Harbaugh? Well, then he could just leave for the NFL. I mean, we've seen him already have those flirtations, right? So, I don't know what you do exactly. I mean, you could take scholarships away, I guess, would be the closest thing to draft picks. But again, then you're potentially punishing a kid that wants to go to Michigan that, maybe on the fringe there that, then has to go somewhere else. I don't know. The NCAA has never had a great way of handling situations in my mind. And frankly, I don't even know if anything comes of it. I mean, we've seen so many of these cases, some that looked very clear cut in terms of, clearly something was wrong here and very little or no punishment comes out of it. Now, obviously, Michigan has some other stuff in the recruiting side that's, that resulted in Jim Harbaugh taking a self-imposed 3-game suspension earlier this season. So there's a lot going on with that program right now, and it's off the field. It's not all positive.
Absolutely. And Greg Schiano, this is a clip that's been shown all over social media, of course, stepping off the field at halftime, and the network reporter asking about his evaluation of the first half, and then he basically says that there's something wrong. There's definitely something wrong. We'll have to address it. We'll have to adjust to it. So in the aftermath of this, it's pretty clear what he's talking about. Now, how they pick up on that, I would think that they're putting formations out there and plays that maybe they can see how the the opponent Michigan is adjusting to it rather quickly, or changing their alignment immediately. Otherwise, I don't know how they're necessarily detecting that they have knowledge that they shouldn't otherwise have. So
yeah, it is a weird, like, how this all came about. I think will also be a story to follow if that ever comes out, really, right? I mean, sign stealing in, just seeing what the other team is doing and picking up on, okay, this leads to this, is something that happens in football at all levels. But it's obviously the stuff that goes beyond that, in-person scouting and whatnot, that is the difference. So maybe they recognize that, this person that's on the sideline for Michigan was also in the press box, or so, I don't know. I'm just speculating, but it is a very, interesting time for this to come out, and an interesting situation all overall.
And like you, I don't have the perfect solution in terms of a penalty if it is in fact true, just like I haven't had the perfect solution for penalties for anything, because it's impossible to just target the culprits and protect the innocent.
Yeah.
And we can't go back. And obviously, any type of cheating, uh, especially in-game cheating or preparation for a game cheating, relates directly to what happened on the field, and you can't erase what we've seen. You can't erase results. You can't go back and say, okay, Ohio State would have been in the playoff, therefore they're playing. You just can't do that. So
yeah, and you're not rewriting Big Ten championships. I think, like, you're not just because Michigan didn't. If Michigan does have to vacate wins, I don't think that means, what is it? Purdue and Iowa were the two teams they faced in the title game. I don't think that means that those teams just get credit for being Big Ten champions either. And, obviously it doesn't change. You can take the 2 games that Michigan beat Ohio State off the record, but it still happened. The one thing is interesting is Michigan's about to be the first team in college football to 1,000 wins. And, if somebody pointed out to me on a radio thing I did earlier this week that if Michigan loses 1 game before Ohio State goes to Ann Arbor, that could be the game that could potentially be the 1,000th win. Well, now this kind of throws a monkey wrench in things. Who knows when there will be any sort of decision made on it, but I guess it could affect that if you're into those kind of statistics.
Yeah, we can all think back upon some strange oddities in sports, and that would be one. That there's this big celebration that Michigan's the first program in history that hits 1,000, and then sometime in the off season they knock out 9 wins or something, and they go in reverse. And what are they going to do? Celebrate it again a year from now? Yes, and to think, not to go back into history for too long, but how Tattoo Gate and all of that, and I certainly, regardless of what the rules are, even if they don't make much sense and don't seem, productive or beneficial to anyone. The rules are the rules, and you got to abide by the rules. And there were things that were going on, of course, with Ohio State players trading awards for tattoos that were not allowed, and then the cover up. But in this NIL world, that seems so ridiculous now. And then also, just again, I separate. Well, first, there are criminal acts that to me are just on one end of the spectrum, are just hideous and horrible. Jerry Sandusky at Penn State. So that to me is completely beyond football.
Right.
That's just a criminal act. So if we deal just with football cheating, even what, again, the Ohio State players did 12 or 13 years ago, on one hand, it was against the rules, needed to be punished. But on the other hand, it was not there. There is cheating in that fashion that is just against the rules. Then there is cheating to gain a competitive advantage, whether that's in recruiting, whether that's in game preparation and so forth, that I personally put in a different category as well.
Yeah, and I've talked to a number of the guys that were on that team that got in trouble for the Tattoo Gate. Some guys that were involved and some guys that were just on the team. And, they kind of laugh about it now. Obviously, time heals all wounds, but especially with, as you mentioned, the NIL stuff that's going on, how kind of ludicrous that is to think back on. And, you think about, assuming NIL continues in its current form, think about kids that grow up with football with NIL. You try and explain to them that guys were getting in trouble for stuff that is now legal that they've never known of. And I've been told that there were guys doing other stuff that didn't have, like stuff that happens everywhere, signing autographs for money and things like that, that stuff never comes out often. And that happens all over the place. And now you can do that. No problem.
And then you talk about just altering history of the program and really the conference and all of college football. Head coach who's highly successful uh, is then, leaves the program
Yep.
and is replaced by another highly successful coach who goes undefeated, but can't play for a championship.
Right.
It's
Well, yeah.
crazy to try to filter through what would have happened. Jim
Yeah.
Tressel would have been the head coach for who knows how much longer.
Yeah. And then, who succeeds him? Obviously, I think Urban Meyer he probably ends up somewhere because that was, he still very much wanted to coach. So he would have had to find somebody else. And Urban Meyer brings in Ryan Day to this program. And so who eventually succeeds Tressel at Ohio State would have been interesting. And, what Tressel does with, a Braxton Miller. Obviously he fit very well into Urban's offense, but certainly you'd seen Tressel have more success with quarterbacks with Troy Smith and Terrell Pryor and whatnot. And yeah, it certainly would have been very interesting to kind of play out in an alternate reality.
I know there are some sites and books and things that have been written, not just about that scenario, but others through college football history that have done a nice job of, because it just kind of unravels all
Yeah.
sorts of, you got to be able to follow the thread and really think it through, because then it impacts all sorts of other things as well. If you had to put your finger on one thing, because as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's really everything. Everyone needs to play, all hands on deck. Everybody needs to be on their game. But where would you start the list in regards to not just Ohio State's concerns, but matching those against Penn State's strengths?
Yeah, I mean, I think we start at the top with the offensive line, and I think that's going to be crucial in not only stopping the pass rush to Kyle McCord, but the run game that we talked about too. Can they at least get some rush going if you're Ohio State? I also think it's going to be interesting to watch how this. I won't call it bend don't break, but this defense, Ohio State, the shell on the defense, not allowing big plays, how that works against this Penn State defense that there's been a lot of talk that they don't have explosive plays. Well, if they're okay with just dinking and dunking down the field, then does that play into, what side wins in that battle when it's kind of both teams' strengths, right? Penn State's willing to move the ball methodically sometimes. Now, some of the reason for that is because they've had a lot of short fields, but if they're not going to make a mistake by trying to throw long or things like that, then this defense will have to make stops in the red zone, which it's been okay at. So I think there's some interesting dynamics there. I've pointed to him a lot this year in terms of an X factor guy, but Cade Stover, for me, how Penn State contains him while also trying to contain the other weapons Ohio State has, especially if Emeka Egbuka plays. He's a guy who I think continues to under the radar be a very dangerous weapon for Ohio State, and could end up getting some postseason recognition for his play this year. So those are kind of the things just that come off the top of my head in terms of where Ohio State, where the matchups are that could be interesting.
Pat Murphy, a Bucknuts 247 Sports, breaking down Ohio State football. Are you a big prediction guy, Pat? Do you make predictions at the end of the week?
Yeah, we've got our predictions story that'll come out later today. I have not officially put anything together because I assemble everyone else's and put it on the site, so I get kind of the last guess. But I did do a prediction with our Penn State site earlier in the week, and I said Ohio State 24, Penn State 20. I'll probably still stick with that one, but yeah, something around that at least.
We're thinking along the same lines in regards to score range, that's for sure. A little bit of offense, but not some crazy fireworks type game. Pat, thanks so much for stopping by. Appreciate you doing this. Enjoy the game, and we will catch up soon.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, Mark.
All right, folks, I'll stay on here for a few minutes. We've got a lot of comments and questions there in the chat that we will address here. And again, we appreciate Pat stopping by, breaking down the Buckeyes for us. We do our Ohio State show every Wednesday, typically on Wednesday, 11 a.m. Eastern time. It was on Monday this week. So subscribe to the Buckeyes channel and hit that bell for the notifications to know when we go live. Yeah, shoot, I could talk about that whole tattoo gate situation forever. David Greenshield, good to see David here. Loves Carnell Tate. Interesting to see if he can step up. Brandon Innes getting a little bit of time as well. Yes. Pat's one of our go-to guys for sure. Buckeye 80 likes Ohio State in this one, 30-24. What you got, Mello, number 7? Just to catch everyone up, the NCAA is seeking to prove that Michigan used a military agent named Connor Stallions. Yes, I read that story today to lead a vast network of football spies. None of what I have just written is. Yeah, so there is a lot of information that's going to come out, as is always the case with these late breaking stories. There's the initial hit, and then the reporters out there that are paid to uncover these stories and talk to people and have sources start to uncover the details. David, any thoughts on if Emeka plays or what receiver steps up? You talked about Carnell Tate made a big catch down the seam against Purdue in particular. I got to think that there's an evaluation going on between Carnell Tate, what he brings to the table, and Julian Fleming, because Julian Fleming's a player that I expected to have a better season, to be more of a breakout player, considering what he gave Ohio State in last season, where he started to emerge, started to be a really, really strong number 3 receiver on an offense that's obviously explosive with the number 1 draft pick at quarterback. And we've just not seen Julian Fleming continue that upward trajectory. Now, some of that can be attributed to the offensive pace and style and the limited pass attempts downfield and the lack of explosiveness compared to having a veteran in CJ Stroud and a guy that was of that status. Peninsula says whoever loses this game should be eliminated from playoff contention. Well, there's still another big game to play for each one of them against Michigan. Therefore, we are going to have a 1-for-1 situation after this game. Of course, somebody's going to notch an enormous win. Somebody is going to notch a loss that is going to be damaging, but still with that one other game to make up for it, that could cause a 3-way tie at 11-1. These three teams have defeated 34 consecutive opponents in the Big Ten, outside of course, playing each other. And so this 11-1 scenario that is highly possible is unlike anything we've ever seen in college football. And if you have that example, please show it to me. But I've got a pretty good read and a pretty good grasp on college football history, and we've never seen 3 11-1 teams in one conference. We may have seen in the past, and I believe we've seen 3 one-loss teams within the conference, but at that point there was no college football playoff selection to be made. They just went to their bowl games, and there was a conference tiebreaker system that determined who won the conference and who moved on to that conference's number 1 bowl position, and then they went from there. And it wasn't as important or as severe a decision as to who is advancing to the Big Ten championship game, who is going to be left at home, and it working into a playoff scenario. That is a nightmare scenario for the playoff committee, to have all 3 of those teams go 11-1, because the winner will move on to a Big Ten championship, but that championship will not necessarily have been earned, meaning it's going to be a tiebreaker system. So you're going to have 11-1, 11-1, 11-1, all 8-1 in the Big Ten, all having lost to each other. Let's say Ohio State beats Penn State, then Penn State beats Michigan, then Michigan beats Ohio State. Whatever the formula, there's a few different ways it can happen. The result is 11-1, 11-1, 11-1, and really there is no clear-cut champion. There's a champion based on a tiebreaker system, just so somebody can show up in Indianapolis to play the title game, but that team will not have proven to be better than the other 2. They just happened to win a tiebreaker system. So the committee doesn't care about tiebreaker systems. That's just another data point that team will have in defeating what looks to be Iowa right now. Could be somebody else. Iowa's certainly not sewing it up, but they are the clear front runner at this point. Inexplicably, well, I can't explain it, so it's not inexplicable, but it's unfathomable to a certain extent. As we get close to November, Northwestern and Nebraska still control their own destiny. They play this weekend. The winner of that game controls its own destiny. If they win out or have the same number of losses as Iowa and defeat Iowa, they will go to the Big Ten championship game. So the Big Ten championship win for whomever, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, will be another data point in the positive direction, most likely, unless they lose. Of course, if they lose, they're gone. And then you've got the team that participated in the Big Ten championship game getting knocked out of playoff consideration versus the other 2 sitting at home. I want as much chaos as possible. Outside of my own team running the table, winning out, I would love to see all sorts of chaos, 1-loss teams all over the place for this committee to have to deal with, because it just causes great drama, intrigue, conversation. Jim, you're probably right. Iowa blows. Well, they blow on one facet of the game. The other 2 are exceptional. They're elite. They're elite on defense. They're elite in special teams. They blow completely on offense. Yes, they do. They're atrocious. Although I could make an argument that they're really not as bad on offense as the statistics would show. Some of it's because of style of play and because they know if they get a 1-score lead, they're going to win the game. So they just choose to punt. Basically, if you watch the game against Wisconsin, there came a point in that game, even with a one-score lead, and then definitely once they made it 15-6, which was fairly early in the second half when Iowa made it 15-6, they just refused to throw the ball because they knew we're not going to lose this game. The best way for us to lose this game is to actually try to convert third downs by throwing the ball, putting the ball in harm's way, turning it over, and giving Wisconsin a chance. Therefore, 3rd and 8, we're just going to run. Just going to run the ball, punt, because we got the best punter in the country. We've got one of the best defenses in the country, and Wisconsin can't move the ball against us. They can move the ball a little bit. Wisconsin threw for about 230 yards, but next to nothing on the ground, and that's the way Iowa plays. Now, is that successful? It depends what your definition of success is. To win that division, it's successful. To win beyond that, it's not successful. But based on what their situation is right now, where they've lost 2 of the best tight ends in the country, they've lost their quarterback, Cade McNamara, who, let's face it, it's not a great quarterback, but is a good game manager who won a Big Ten championship. They're missing all those guys. And they've had other injuries on offense. So they are playing the way they need to play to have a chance to win now and almost to secure the wins. So again, Joe, when you say it's funny here, Joe, I'm not disagreeing with you completely, but I am to a certain extent. Because if that game would have been 45-42, if those teams played 45-42 type games every week, talking about Iowa and Wisconsin, then you probably wouldn't be making that comment. You certainly wouldn't be making the boring comment. You might still be calling, you would not be calling them inept. You would say, well, they got bad defenses, but they're not inept. They're winning and losing games 45-42 every week. Why is that any different? That would mean that their defenses suck. Their defenses are horrible. They can't stop anyone, and they have no chance against Ohio State, Penn State, or Michigan. It's just the opposite. It's just that this isn't such an aberration. Yeah, David, that's a tough go right there. Emeka Buka out, Denzel Burke out. They're both huge losses. I think Burke is a slightly more impactful loss, slightly. But if neither one of them can play, and even if they can play, you've got to kind of question the effectiveness. There you go, Search, UCLA fan. I would have loved to have seen that game this year. UCLA's got an excellent defense, struggling at quarterback with the young quarterback Dante Moore, but Michigan, UCLA. Michigan fans, I don't expect you to take the shots for your team here, your program canceling the UCLA series. It's not your fault, but it is a bit weak. And I've said that many times. I'm on record saying Michigan's weak for canceling a series against UCLA. And for good reason that's obvious to everyone. It's a different situation with Ohio State canceling against Washington. That's a conference game now. Doug, Mark is a Michigan fan. Tell us, Buckeyes fans, what your fan base is feeling. Good one. What they're feeling elated, overjoyed. They're dominating opponents. They're winning. What are they feeling about this mess? Ohio State winning the Big Ten and going undefeated during the regular season. All right, folks. Appreciate you being here. Ohio State, Penn State. What we're going to do is what we typically do on Saturday is we check out the best games in college football. And of course, this is the top of the stack. And then we do our instant analysis. So please join us for instant analysis after the game. Ohio State, Penn State will have post game. We've got you covered. We've got Ohio State post game on the Ohio State channel. We have live Penn State post game right here on the main channel. And then I will do an instant analysis segment as well. So be looking out for that. I usually lock in on 2 noon games give you instant analysis on 2 games. Of course, I'm going to have 1.5 eyeballs on Ohio State, Penn State, and a half an eyeball, I guess, on whatever is the second best game of the noon window. And we do that throughout the day. And you guys have responded really well to those instant analysis videos. So we will continue to do those. And don't forget, Saturday night after the primetime games, we're here taking your calls right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you being here. Enjoy the game. We may be on later tonight. Turn on the notifications to know when we go live. In the meantime, if you want to go to Ohio State, Penn State, want to get yourself in the door, feel that environment, go to ticketsmarter.com. The get-in price is $170. We understand $170 to get in price to Ohio Stadium for the game. If you go to ticketsmarter.com, you can get $20 off. BIG20 is our promo code, and you can use that all season. It's not a one-time deal. You can use that promo code BIG for $10 off, BIG20 for $20 off for the rest of the season. Appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. We will see you soon.